Hello, team players! So, I've done a lot of teamwork builds in the past 4 years that I've been doing this, but I realized I never actually went through a definition of what I consider good teamwork in this system. Specifically, what types of things you need to cover in order to be an effective team. So, let's talk about it. I personally believe that any class in the game can cover about 90% of what I'm going to cover in this video. So it doesn't matter what you play, it's about how you play it. Obviously, there's going to be certain things that if you're playing all spellcasters, you're not going to be able to do, and if you're playing all marshals, you're not going to be able to do. But as long as you have a good balance of marshals and spellcasters, you should be able to cover everything that any class in the game can't cover. Now, obviously, some classes are going to be better at others in some of these roles, but you should be able to cover all of them, or at least most of them, with any class in the game. I'm going to give you guys some basic examples in this video, but believe me, I'm going to go into more detail in my future teamwork builds. My goal is to prove once and for all that it doesn't matter what you're playing, it's about how you play it and what feats you pick. Now, the focus of this video is on combat roles, but I do want to talk a little bit about out-of-combat roles as well. That's mostly going to be your skills and certain spells. Mostly skills, though. I mean, granted, you've got spells like Light and Fly, which are important for getting around to get to the next combat, but it's mostly going to be your skills. Pathfinder 2e is designed so that you can get around with just skills. And obviously, if you've got any rogue in the party, that will pretty much cover all the skills you need. But if you've got something like a cleric in the party, then they're going to cover the wisdom-based skills pretty well. Things like nature and medicine and all that. And then, the sorcerer can cover the charisma skills, and any intelligence-based class, including things like alchemist, can cover the intelligence-based skills. So, as long as you've got a decent amount of characters that go off different stats, you should be fine on the skill front. Now, of course, we do gotta talk about damage rolls, because they are important. They're just not every single thing. The first thing I want to talk about is burst damage and multi-target damage. I'm covering these two because these two are basically the spellcaster's bread and butter. You can definitely cover these with marshals, but multi-target especially is hard for marshals, including something like Megas. Burst damage is obviously your big effects, like your Megas spell strike, your power attack, or even like something like a fireball. And of course, multi-target spells are things like fireball and lightning bolt and stuff like that. Something can hit multiple enemies. Obviously, your burst damage is for when you're like, okay, this creature needs to go now because it's really screwing over the party. So let's do a bunch of damage to it and hopefully it dies. And of course, multi-target there's a whole bunch of mooks that are helping the boss, and well, we need to get rid of them. Now obviously, spellcasters are going to be a lot better at multi-target than they are at single target. Single target is the marshals thing, but we'll get to that in a second. Just about every spellcaster in the game can cover multi-target well, except for occult casters. Occult casters are more of a support, so they don't have a whole lot of spells, at least not on the damage side, that can hit multiple targets. They do have a few good burst spells. Overall, most spellcasters will be able to cover this role very well. Marshals, not so much. The ones that are especially good for this are Arcane and Primal, though. Of course, the flip side of that is single target sustained DPR, damage per round, because you need both. Because if all you have is these big effects that deal a bunch of damage, or effects that can deal a good amount of damage to a lot of enemies, when you run into a boss fight, you're going to have a lot of trouble. A lot of bosses have a ton of HP, or one really good save, or a bunch of really good saves. So these big effects will not always work. You need sustained damage that you can do round after round after round. And that's where the marshals come in, especially barbarians. Spellcasters can be good at this, but this is the marshals' bread and butter. A lot of players that play casters feel like they should be able to do single target sustained DPR with things like cantrips, which they can do, but things like fighters are going to be so much better than that at it because of their increased accuracy in situations like boss fights, for example. Because the boss is going to have good saving throws. Period. There's no denying it. The fact of the matter is you need both. The burst, multi-target, and sustained DPR single target. If you don't, you're going to have fights that should be relatively easy end up being way tougher than they should be. But if you do, you can take fights that are severe and get them down to moderate pretty darn easily. And then of course it's just a matter of cleanup. And then of course you got the ability to target different defenses. A lot of people think that marshals can't really do this. When it comes to damage, they're pretty much right. But we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to non-damaging options. Every caster has spells that target different saving throws. Some of them don't do damage, but especially things like the arcane list and the primal list will definitely target different saving throws if you pick your spells correctly. It is a matter of what you're picking though. I mean, if you pick nothing but reflex spells, well, if you run something like a Drake with a high reflex, then you're going to be in trouble. You're probably going to end up targeting either their fortitude or their reflex save. One is definitely going to be lower than the other in most situations, but there's also the will save spells that kind of, I mean, those are mostly debuffs, but still, you do want to have some of those. And then, of course, we got damage types, which spellcasters are really good at, but marshals can be as well. Obviously, if you're a marshal, you're stuck with slashing, piercing, or bludgeoning damage, depending on what weapon you're using, which is why it's good to have multiple different types of weapons in your possession, particularly melee versus range, because flying enemies are a thing, even at low levels. But obviously, if you're a spellcaster, then you're going to have access to a lot more damage types, especially if you're an arcane or primal caster. Although, things like spirit damage will affect just about everything, but it is good to have as many damage types as you can, because if you run into an enemy that's immune, resistant, or even weak to certain elements, then you can pick the right spell for the situation, instead of being completely useless because you're facing a construct and all you have is spirit damage. Or you're facing something like a troll and don't have fire or acid to shut off its regeneration. Keep in mind that summoning spells can also give you an effective advantage, because there are creatures out there that you can summon that can give you different damage types that you normally wouldn't have access to, like the water method's acid attack. This is one of the reasons why alchemists are so good, is because they have access to every damage type in the game, pretty much, as long as you pick the right items for your formula book. But every spellcaster in the game can cover some type of damage. Obviously, Arcane and Primal are going to be the best for this, but the Divine list is very good at Vitality and Void damage, as well as Spirit damage. And the Occult list has some amazing mental damage spells, which is non-lethal damage, but it is damage, and does count toward you knocking them out. And of course, non-damaging options are at least as important, I would say more important. If you don't have burst healing, then you could run into a boss and they could take out your best fighter in one hit, maybe two. And you wouldn't really be able to get them up unless you have like battle medicine or something, which I highly recommend you pick up battle medicine on at least one character. And you need out of combat healing, because otherwise you'll run into an encounter at half health, and then it takes what should have been a low encounter into a moderate encounter, or what should have been a moderate encounter to a severe encounter, because you have to spend more resources doing the more burst healing. I highly recommend you pick up medicine, which, as long as you got decent wisdom, you should be able to put on any character. And of course, action economy manipulation is also pretty important. You know, this is your trips, your grapples, your difficult terrain, your lowering their speed, all that kind of stuff. If you're facing a boss and you take away one or even two of their actions, that's a big deal. Because if you take away one of their actions, then if they have a 3-action ability, guess what? They don't get to use it, period. And if you take away 2 actions, there are a lot of big effects that monsters can do that take 2 actions, which means that those are off the table too. And if you're tripping and grappling, then you're probably a marshal, which means the boss now has to use their big effects on the guy who wants to take it versus the spellcaster. And also, if they want to go after the spellcaster, no more big effects. and they get 1 attack. And that might even trigger a reactive strike. And if you can inflict grapple or trip and slowed on a creature, you've basically taken them out of the fight completely for that round. I mean, they can either move or attack, and that's it, because they have 1 action. Terrain manipulation is also a lot more powerful than people think it is, if you use it right. Because if you could slow an enemy down by half, they may have to spend 2 actions to get up within range of anybody. Yeah, it's probably only going to affect them for 1 round, but 1 round can make all the difference in the world. That can basically allow the player to heal people, or you can set up another trap, or you can set up something like Bless, or Bane, or whatever. And difficult terrain also means they can't step, which means more reactive strikes for your fighter, or someone else who has reactive strike. And then of course we got buffs and debuffs, which obviously any caster in the game can pull off. But, and this is what I mentioned before when I said marshals could target any save too, marshals can just as easily do it. Trips, grapples, obviously grapples target fortitude, trips target reflex, and demoralized targets will. So no matter what, marshals can also buff and debuff, mostly with circumstance penalties though. But buffing is definitely spellcasters' bread and butter here. As a lot of spellcasters can buff allies without even relying on their main casting stats, as that only applies mostly to debuffs and damage spells. And of course, any marshal in the game can do these as long as they have a free hand or a feat that lets them do it without a free hand. Things like Bastion can help with that. And of course, soaking damage is always a good thing, although you don't need it for every party. I mean, granted, it is nice to have something like a champion that can reduce damage and take hits. Because if you got that, then you're not going to need as much healing. A good champion would probably have something like Lay on Hands, which would be helpful for the out-of-combat healing. You could also have something like a Barbarian who has massive HP and can take hits for days, especially with healing, like burst healing. But like I said, you don't really need it for every party, but there are parties who could definitely use it. And of course, then we've got the option that everybody forgets about, recall knowledge. About 50% of the things I covered in this video are going to be better if you have someone who's at least decent at recall knowledge. Knowing anything about the creature's stat block can only help. For example, it can tell you what creatures are immune to, resistant to, or even weak to when it comes to damage types. It can also tell you what their lowest save is, so you know what spells to use against them, and what buffs and debuffs to use, as well as helping you with action economy and manipulation. For example, if you know that the creature can fly, you're not going to do any difficult terrain because that won't work. And you probably aren't going to try to trip it because it will more than likely have a high reflex. So yes, recall knowledge is definitely important here, and I always have at least one character in the party that can do some sort of recall knowledge. Doesn't matter whether it's intelligence or wisdom based. And of course, there are spells that work better if the creature has a fly speed. Overall, recall knowledge combined with the other stuff I talked about in this video can definitely help you out in tough combats, particularly if you use it right. Of course, there is always the chance that you'll get false information, but when it does work, it is very effective. Now, what I covered in this video is mostly what I'm going to be using from now on my teamwork builds to give you guys a better idea of what these builds can do, and to give you a basic idea of the team strategy for these builds. And of course, if you guys want to continue this conversation, you can absolutely do it on my Discord server, which is in the description below. You can also check out my Patreon page for Google Sheets for all my builds all the way to level 20. And of course, if you guys want to see tips for alchemists, you can check out this video here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, teamwork is vital. It helps us solve problems.